Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for coming out, folks. I recognize a lot of people in the crowd here, so good to see you. And also, I want to point out that Mike Hoffman, who's speaking next month, is actually here as well. So I'm Dr. Ray Reesler. I'm the director of the Museum of Natural History at UWSP, and I'm also an archaeologist with the state of Wisconsin. And I've done archaeological work in this part of the state for about 30 years. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is one of the earlier time periods in Wisconsin, which is the late Paleo-Indian. So some of you are pretty familiar with this, but for those who aren't, basically humans showed up in Wisconsin as soon as the ice started to melt from Illinois north. And so we've got sites in Wisconsin in the Kenosha area that are about 16,500 years old, so seriously old. I'm going to be talking about sites that are more in the 10,000 year range, but I will touch on those earlier sites also. And the evidence from those early sites is really rare. There wasn't a big population here. They were extremely mobile. They moved around the landscape. In fact, they moved in a huge kind of seasonal or yearly round, and they might be in Wisconsin, down into Illinois, out into Iowa, the Dakotas, back up into Ontario, and then back in Wisconsin. So we see stone tools from various sites in all of those states scattered in the other states. So here in Wisconsin, we find a lot of material that comes from Iowa, Illinois, Ontario, as far west as Yellowstone. So early people were really moving around the landscape. Specifically, what I'm going to talk about tonight is what we call ritual sites or ceremonialism, which is an area we know even less about. So the early people who were inhabiting Wisconsin, they did lots of sort of day-to-day things like you would expect. They hunted, later on they grew crops, they fished, they built habitations, and that evidence is rare but fairly easy to come across. The kind of evidence like the burned artifacts you see up here on the screen are extremely rare. In the last 50 years, we've only found 9 sites, and every one of those sites is in the upper western Great Lakes area. And there's some strong connections between those sites that I'll talk about a little bit tonight. Next one. So the story starts in about 1959. So at the base of Door County, a site called the Rainier site was discovered by archaeologists who happened to be doing random testing. And so they were walking along a ridge above Green Bay, and they thought, this is a good place to dig a hole and see if there's anything here. They came right down on cremation and a burial in about a 3-foot by 3-foot square. So it was incredible luck that they actually hit it at all. And the artifacts that were found were ritually destroyed. Artifacts tend to be used till the very end. They're resharpened, made into other tools, worn down. Native Americans did not discard stone tools in Wisconsin until they were completely exhausted. And one of the reasons for that is we have very little good tool stone or stone suitable to make stone tools out of. So when you find very large, pristine artifacts that are intentionally snapped and broken or burned and broken, it's sort of a red flag that something else is going on. These are not just sites where they used up the tools and then threw them in a trash pit. There's something else going on. So the site that was found in '59, they hit a human skeleton, and the human skeleton was burned, and they continued to dig down below that human skeleton, and then they found these other artifacts. And the other artifacts they found are about 10,000 years old. At the time in 1959, no other site like this had ever been found in North America. So they took a shot at explaining what was going on. And they described it as a human cremation burial from 10,000 years ago. And every similar site that has been found since then has been assumed to be a human cremation burial. I and some other archaeologists in the Midwest here have our doubts about whether that's actually the case. And so I've been working specifically with an archaeologist, Dr. Jeff Boehm out of UW Oshkosh, and he and I have been working for about 10 years on this project. When we look at the evidence, what we see is that there are cremated artifacts, and occasionally there's a burial, but we don't know, we cannot yet argue that those burials have anything to do with the artifacts. So in the case of Rainier, we went back, we found the original artifacts. They're in the Neville Museum in Green Bay. We read as many of the original reports and field notes as we could. Ron and Carol Mason, who excavated it in 1959, are now in their mid-80s. Their memory is a little sketchy. 59 was a couple years ago. but they described to us how they did the excavation, and we now think, no question, they hit cremated or burned human remains, but we think those remains are only about 1,000 years old. And they continued to dig deeper, and that's when they found these other artifacts that are about 10,000 years old. And that's very common on archaeological sites. Humans tend to use the same location over and over again, especially if it's a site near water or if it's a high point of ground, a good place to camp or a good place to gather resources or hunt or fish. Those sites can be continuously used, and we call those multi-component, meaning we might find an entire record in stone tools that's 10 or 12,000 years long. So there can be a very long record. In 1971, a really similar find was made right here in the middle of Waupaca County. This was on Paul Pope's farm over on Walla Walla Creek. And it was immediately categorized as exactly the same as the Rainier site, a cremation burial. Bones were recovered when Paul first found the artifacts. So Paul, I don't know if any of you knew Paul Pope, but he was here for a very long time. Paul was a really good avocational archaeologist, collected all kinds of stone artifacts, arrowheads, spear points, and he really knew his stuff. And when he found these points on his farm, he had farmed that same field for 50 years before these showed up. He knew instantly that they were extremely unusual. And he knew that they had gone through a fire. He knew they were burned. So he took them to a guy named Ritzenthaler down at UW Oshkosh. Along with the bone, Ritzenthaler took the points to the Milwaukee Public Museum, and the bone fragments that were with the points disappeared in 1971 and have never been seen since. So we don't know if they were human bone or not. Subsequently, between 1971 and about 2000, Paul collected more bone on the site. And the entire site is only 3 feet by 3 feet, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet. We're talking a tiny little area. This spring, the family gave UW Oshkosh and myself permission to explore that field and look for that site. And Willis Pope, Paul's son, hadn't been really looked at that site since 1971. He walked out into that 100-acre field, walked right up to that 3 foot by 3 foot area, which is nondescript in the middle of a cornfield, and said, this is where it is. We excavated it. We found less than we wanted, but I did find one piece of stone which exactly fits the points that Paul found in 1971. So we know that we hit the site. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those sites, all of the sites that have been found, and then give my take on what we think is happening. Next. So these are where the sites are. They're really scattered around the western Great Lakes. And they were found at different dates. Again, Rainier was the earliest in 59. Kind of forget the find dates. They don't really mean much, except that's when somebody happened to stumble on those sites. But kind of look at the pattern of where these sites are. And what's interesting is almost all of the sites, 7 out of 9 sites, use Hixton silicified sandstone, this kind of material. This comes from Jackson County, Wisconsin. And people in every one of these sites came to Jackson County, Wisconsin to get this particular stone. And archaeologists have suspected for a long time that Hixton silicified sandstone, also called just Hixton for short, had a lot more meaning than just a good hunk of rock to make tools out of. We think that there's a ritual meaning associated with this type of stone. And the more we learn about where this stone traveled after it was quarried in Jackson County, the more we realize that's almost certainly the case. So this stone was taken all the way down the Mississippi River. We find points in Cahokia and south, down near St. Louis. We find Hickston material all the way out to the East Coast. We find Hickston material up to Thunder Bay in Ontario. They were coming to get this stone, and not just because it was good to make tools out of. There's some other connection. And I have a frame of Hickston points after the talk. If you want to come up, I can show you some more artifacts made out of Hickston. And I'm happy to answer any questions once I'm done. Next. So one of the puzzles for archaeologists is to try and figure out, what does ritual mean? And how do you sort out what are everyday artifacts and what everyday sites look like, and how that's different from ritual sites? And one thing about ritual sites is we don't tend to see them, and again, this is my take as a non-indigenous archaeologist. We don't tend to see them very close to village sites. We tend to see them a little bit set apart. That can be true for burial mound sites, it can be true for rock art sites, and it can be true for other sites where something other than kind of day-to-day activities are going on. That's not just true for North America. I did a lot of my research in North Australia. It's exactly the same thing. The rock art sites and the burial sites were never immediately next to the campsites, and that makes a little bit of sense. They're a different type of site, and they're used for different things. But it's tricky when you're just looking at stone tools to kind of put that whole story together. So one of my early archaeology professors said, if you took a 1929 Cadillac and you pulled out the left headlight and you got rid of the rest of the car rusted away and there's nothing left, and all you have is that left headlight, then describe the whole story about producing that car and what it looked like. That's kind of what archaeology is. We're working from bits and pieces and trying to tell the story. Another question is, can archaeology really talk about religion or ritual? And I think that we can, and it used to be very uncommon. In fact, archaeologists ran screaming away from this problem because they thought that it would ruin their careers. And they really stuck to what they found in the ground and describing that, to the extent that they were unwilling to even talk to Native Americans. Native Americans were seen as an unreliable source that complicated the story. We don't really believe that so much anymore. Not that you can't be fooled, but you need to look at all sources of information and weigh it out. Another question is, can ordinary objects become specialized or religious or used in rituals? And certainly they can, and often there's some indications, like the point on the right. This is a 10,000-year-old Scots Bluff. It's covered in what's called red ochre. So it's iron ore, and that red powdered ochre is very commonly found on ritual sites, all the way from Clovis times, the very earliest sites found in all of North America. Some of you may be familiar with the Anzac site in Montana. It's also called the Anzac Child site. It's a very young individual, under about a year, and that child was buried with a complete toolkit about 14,000 years ago. So the child was way too young to have used any of those tools, but all of those tools were covered with red powdered ochre. We see that a lot on burial sites in Wisconsin. In fact, it's one of the way burial sites are found. So if somebody is digging a basement or a highway is going in and you see this big plume of red or pink in the soil, for an archaeologist, that's literally a red flag. We know that something is going on there. Another thing is, how do you figure out what's what? And that part of that is experience and looking at site after site after site so that you've got a big data set to compare to. And so we'll kind of investigate both of those as we go along here. Next. So we're going to talk about the Rainier site first. And so this, again, as I said, was originally categorized as a cremation burial. And I should also interject that all burials, whether recorded or not, have been protected in Wisconsin since 1986. And even trained archaeologists such as myself are not allowed to dig a burial. Once it's designated a burial, we are prohibited by law from disturbing it again. And that'll come into play a little bit later here. And this was also the type site for something called the Rainier Ceremonial Complex, which was coined by two fellow archaeologists, Norm Meinholz and Steve Kuhn. They investigated a site called the Dead Man's Slough site, kind of a dead giveaway there, but way up in the northwestern corner of Wisconsin. And they tried to describe this same set of sites. We have a few more sites today than when they looked at it. But they, again, were trying to describe these sites based on human cremation burials. And what you can see here are the artifacts that were recovered at Rainier. And so you can see that these are partial artifacts. They're not whole. And these were originally categorized as Scots Bluff. So Scots Bluff is a culture that originated about 10,000 years ago, maybe 10,500 years ago, on the plains, and these were bison hunters. We tend to see Scots Bluff artifacts into Wisconsin, but not much further east of here. So we know that this was sort of a bison hunting culture. When it got to Wisconsin, it morphed into bison woodland caribou. They hunted both. And these artifacts were, again, in 1959, the best guess was that these are Scots Bluff artifacts. Since then, we realized these are not quite Scots Bluff artifacts. And for a long time, nobody knew what to call them. Archaeologists in the West said, no way, you can't call those weird things you find in Wisconsin Scots Bluff. And we said, well, nothing else fits as well. We're going to call them Scots Bluff. So they've been called Scots Bluff until just the last couple of years. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. In the bottom right, those are burned cranial fractures. They were described as the burned fragments from a subadult, maybe a young female. This spring, we took a forensic anthropologist over, an osteologist, and we looked at those fragments. We dug through the entire collection, opened up every box, spread everything out on the table. We found all kinds of burned bones from geese and swans, and we found very, very, very little human bone. And one thing that happens when human bone burns is it shrinks incredibly. It shrinks, and then it starts to get powdery and turn white, and eventually it becomes calcined, where it turns a kind of a bright blue-gray. All of that has to do with the temperature at which the bone was burned. This bone was not burned at a very hot temperature. And one of the reasons I and my colleagues think this is unassociated with these other artifacts, the other artifacts went through a fire that was extremely hot, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 degrees. This bone went through a fire that was maybe a couple hundred degrees. So we think that there is no way that that bone burned in the same fire that altered the other artifacts. Next slide. Also at the Rainier site were bifaces. A biface simply means that an artifact is worked on both faces. And bifaces they're one stage in reducing a big block of stone to a smaller artifact, but they're also usable in and of themselves as knives and other tools. So the Rainier site tended to have these broken bifaces, and the projectile points, the actual spear points, were made out of Hixton silicified sandstone. Some of the bifaces are made out of sandstone, but some of them are also made out of chert. There's a mix of materials. And we don't know exactly why there's a mix of materials. We also looked very closely. All of the points were described as having been made by one person. Now, when a person knaps or makes stone tools, it's almost like they leave fingerprints of their identity on them. You can tell stone tools that are made by a right-handed person or a left-handed person by the flaking pattern. You can also pick up clues of if artifacts were made by different people. There's obviously different levels of skill, right? And just like many modern artists today, you can pick out individual traits that let you know a particular artist made something. So on some archaeological sites, you find artifacts that are nearly identical, and you know the same person made them. The Rainier site was originally described as all being made by one person, but when we looked at it this year, we really think that it was made by multiple people because there's really big differences in how the tools were made. Next. So let's jump to the Pope site. So these are the artifacts that were recovered right here in Waupaca County. You can see there's some similarities with the stuff that came off the Rainier site. They're all made out of Hixton silicified sandstone. They are Scott's Bluff-ish, but we're now calling these hardened barbs. And hardened barbs are points that were contemporaneous, cultures that were contemporaneous with Scott's Bluff. But these are people who were living in the lower Mississippi River Valley and all the way up into Wisconsin. But what we see is we see southern type hardened artifacts up until about Janesville, Madison at the furthest north. In this area, we see what we call northern hardened barbs, and that's what these are. So it's a variation that isn't found anywhere else in the country, but we see it kind of in central and northern Wisconsin. And sometimes we call these eared Scott's Bluff. If you look on the base, sometimes there's a little tiny projection at the very bottom of the point. Those are called eared Scott's Bluff or hardened. You'll note that many of these are broken. These went through an extremely hot fire, and two of the artifacts are completely unbroken and did not go through a fire, although they're identical and they're both made out of Hixton. Next. So these are sort of the refits that we came up with. Initially, Ritzenthaler thought that he had maybe 6 or 7 points. When we looked at these under microscopes and compared the size of the point and the actual grain size of each individual rock that these were made from, we came up with 11 separate projectile points. Likely there were many more. There could have been up to 20, 25 projectile points originally. Again, these are all made out of Hixton, and some of these are what is called hypertrophic. Hypertrophic means they're way too big to be used normally, meaning they're too long, they're too thin, they're too wide. If you use them functionally to spear bison or caribou, you would break them instantly. They are just too fragile. So hypertrophic means an artifact that was produced for show or for some kind of ritual context. So certainly the two on the left are hypertrophic. Even the third one from the left would be considered hypertrophic. These are just way too big to be functional artifacts. Next. And these are the two artifacts that were found on the site, again within a 3-foot by 3-foot area, that are completely unburned. We don't tend to see this on the other sites. And this is also kind of driving some of the ideas that we're thinking about of what was happening with Pope. 30 years after Paul discovered this, his nephew found this exhausted Scott's Bluff point within about the same area, probably an area the size of this room, but very close to the site. And we think that it probably does not have anything to do with the site itself or with the hardened artifacts, except that it shows that there were certainly people in that immediate area 10,000 years ago. Next. The Pope site also has these big ovate bifaces. And often those kind of bifaces were called blanks or trade blanks. And that's how people moved the material around the country. You had to have it in some kind of flat form that you could put in a pack or easily transport. And when we map where Hixton is found around the state and out of the state, it follows every major river system and creek. They were getting in canoes and moving this stuff. They weren't just hauling rock all over the landscape. But we tend to see these big bifaces, and then we also have these 3 weathered pieces of bone that Paul collected on the site. After having the original bone fragments disappear in 1971, it took me about 25 years for Paul to give me these 3 pieces of bone. and then we could not figure out what they were. I shopped them around to osteologists and faunal experts, literally all over the country, until eventually a really good expert, Jim Thieler, who used to work at UW-La Crosse, he worked on them for about a month, and then he called me up and he said, I can't believe it, I've spent all this time. These are cow bones. So they're highly weathered. They have nothing to do with the collection, even though Paul picked them up in the same area. This site is actually only about 50 yards from an old barn in the barnyard, so it's not a surprise to find a dead cow in Waupaca County, right? Next. There's also older evidence on Paul's farm. So we have this agate basin point, which dates to about 11,500 that Paul found. And we have this Gainey or Clovis point, which dates to about 14,500. Some of you know that Clovis points are still considered some of the earliest points found in the Americas. These were originally called Clovis points in the Midwest, and now they're being called Gainey points. It's sort of like a local variant, but it's the same time period. And these guys also hunted mammoth and mastodon, elk, bison, probably early Pleistocene horse. So this was a long time ago. Paul's great-grandfather found that point on their farm on Walla Walla Creek. So it's interesting to us as archaeologists to see that people have been on that land down in that part of Waupaca County at least 14,500 years. What that means is they were right on the edge of the ice. And as I've spoken earlier about this, as the glaciers retreated, the glaciers in some ways were like a giant fertilizer factory. They ground up everything in their path, and when they melted back, they left a really, really rich environment. And the first thing that happened was you got really luxuriant grass growth. And what comes to grass? Grazers. So mammoths are grazers, bisons are grazers, elk are grazers. Native Americans were right on that. They were hunting the edge of the ice in those really rich grasslands, and that's what these 2 points represent. But it also makes us wonder, this field of Paul's where we found this stuff is the most nondescript, unlikely looking spot. You would never walk out into this field and dig where Paul found this, which is why he didn't find it till later after farming it for decades and decades. He never bothered looking there because it doesn't look like a place you would find anything. Now we're wondering, is there something about that site, kind of set off by itself, unremarkable, that somehow spoke to Paleo-Indians? Because now we realize almost all of the sites that I showed you on that earlier map are in nondescript, weird places that you would not look for an archaeological site. There are places in the landscape that you would not stumble across. You would have to intentionally figure out, this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to go out in the middle of this field where it's not that close to water. It doesn't look like it's that good for hunting. It wouldn't have been that good for camping. It's really clay soil. And now we think that maybe they were intentionally doing something on those sites in these out-of-the-way places, maybe where they wouldn't be disturbed. Next. So late last year, I took the Pope collection and I took it over to the Neville Museum and I compared it side to side with the Rainier collection. This is sort of a no-brainer, right? We probably should compare these things side to side, but archaeologists rarely get the chance because often the collections are widely dispersed or you can't get permission from a museum to get in and look at them. Luckily, as a museum director, I've sort of got an inside back door to museums, so they let me in. And you can see in the picture up here, I'm comparing the 2 sites side by side. And a couple of things popped out to me. One is that the Pope artifacts were in general much bigger and wider than the Rainier artifacts. And though they were similar, they obviously were not made by the same person or people. The flaking pattern was different, the shape of the base is different. And this is, you could jump ahead, Pat, that's good. And these are sort of the differences. So the artifacts from the Rainier site exhibit crenation fractures. That simply means thermal fractures. So fracturing on stone is really distinctive. You can actually tell if it was burned and cracked, and you can actually tell if it was a dry fire or if it was a fire that had steam in it. Those two fracture patterns are totally different, but they're both associated with heat. There's also bending fractures. If you step on a point, it fractures pretty straight. If you take the point and slowly bend it, and it's hard to get your head around this, but stone bends, it'll bend to a point where it breaks, and it has a very rounded piece and a straight step on it. Those are called bending fractures. So we know when somebody bent a point the wrong direction and snapped it. We also have a host of fractures, impact fractures, half fractures, that are associated with hunting or hitting a large bone on an animal or completely missing the animal and hitting a big rock. All of those create really specific use wear or fractures on stone tools. The tools we're talking about tonight have no use wear fractures. They have completely different fractures. The Pope site also has thermal fracturing, and it looks like some of the artifacts were initially snapped in half or snapped into 3 pieces and then put in a fire. That's pretty intentional destruction. If you make one, you travel a long distance to get this really important type of stone. You bring it to a nondescript area in Waupaca County. You then break it into pieces, and then you place it in a fire so that it gets consumed and burned and fractured into even more pieces. That speaks to something more than everyday activities. Something else is going on there. At the Rainier site, some of the artifacts were used. They did have use wear on them. They weren't broken in use, but they had been resharpened and used. And it's very easy to tell when a stone tool is resharpened, especially if the person who originally made it did an excellent job and the person who resharpened it hacked it. And that at the or hypertrophic. When you resharpen artifacts, it can change the shape and it can confuse what type of artifact it is. And one thing about being an archaeologist for about 35 years is you eventually get to recognize what resharpened artifacts look like. It used to be that when new artifact types would be discovered by archaeologists, they could not tell a whole artifact from a really resharpened one that was, worn right down to a nub. They thought they were actually different types of artifacts. Now we realize it's kind of a continuum. Just like if you've got an axe that you use for chopping wood and you keep it for 40 or 50 years, well, at the end of that time period, you don't have a really long axe if you've been sharpening it. And a worn out axe does not look like a brand new axe at Fleet Farm, right? Same idea here. Metrics simply means the measurements on the points. The measurements on the point at Pope are really fairly identical to the measurements on the Rainier artifacts, with the exception that the Pope artifacts are overall larger, but the comparative dimensions are sort of the same. Large bifaces at Rainier site were a wide range of materials, meaning you had cherts from all over the place. And chert outcrops in Wisconsin in a couple of places, but a lot of the chert, which is also known as flint, that was used in Wisconsin comes out of glacial drift or glacial cobbles that are moved around the landscape. We have lots of that in Portage County and Waupaca County. So some of the cherts that are used, we can't source them. We can't figure out exactly where they came from because they could have been dragged by the glaciers all the way down from Ontario. But the large bifaces at Pope are all made out of Hickston silicified sandstone. No other type of stone was used at Pope. There's no charcoal or clear feature boundaries at Rainier, meaning that often when you dig an archaeological site, you see the boundaries of a hole or a pit or a house dwelling or a burial or a campfire. All of those leave a really distinctive shape and stain in the soil. At both Pope and Rainier, there's nothing in the soil. It's like, why is there no feature here? Why isn't there something obvious here that would tell us what happened? We think one of the reasons is these ceremonies or rituals, whatever they were, took place on the surface of the ground. Whatever they did on the surface of the ground, and they walked away and left the artifacts sitting on the surface. You walk away and leave something on the surface of the ground, and you come back in 10,000 years. Depending on where that is, it can be pretty deeply buried. So in the Rainier site, what they found was about 3 or 4 feet down. At the Pope site, it was about 8 or 10 inches down. The Rainier site was minimally excavated in 1959, meaning they dug a hole 3 foot by 3 foot by about 8 foot deep and never looked beyond the edge of that hole, which is frustrating to us because we now know the site is probably much bigger. There's a lot more artifacts there, but we're no longer allowed to dig on that site because they went through a burial and then hit these other artifacts. So that once a site is designated a burial in the state of Wisconsin, it's protected. At Pope, there is no evidence of a cremation burial. We dug right through what's called the plow zone, that top 12 or 18 inches of tilled soil, right down to bare subsoil at Pope this spring. There's no evidence of fire, there's no charcoal, there's no bone. The reputed cremation burial at Rainier is, we are now convinced, is much younger. One, based on the preservation of the bone. Bone doesn't last 10,000 years in Wisconsin. The soil is way too acidic, which is why we don't find lots of old skeletons or a lot of old mammoth bones or mastodon bones or early mammal bones. They just don't preserve well in Wisconsin soils, unless they're buried deeply in a swamp where there's low oxygen. The bone at Rainier it's in too good a condition to be 10,000 years old. And it, again, as I mentioned, it could not possibly have gone through as hot a fire as fractured the points and have come out as anything beyond powder or ash. So we're quite convinced that they actually dug through a more modern burial, maybe a cremation burial, or maybe a body that happened to be on the surface and a forest fire swept through that area and burned the bone. Again, at Pope, there is no evidence of a cremation burial, even though that's what Pope has been called for decades and decades. It's been called a cremation burial. As a recorded burial site at Rainier, we can't do anything on that site, although we're sort of lobbying the state to let us do some further investigation. And at Pope, we need to do more excavation to we opened up 10 excavation units, 10 3x3 units this spring, which is a pretty big area. We had 1 day. We had a window of 1 day before they wanted to get in and plant the field. And if you remember this spring, it was kind of wet and muddy. So the farmer was really hot to get out in the field, and you can't dig in muddy soil because you can't see anything. So we had to wait till the soil thawed and then dried out enough to actually go out and excavate. And of course, the farmer's breathing down our neck because he wants to get into the field. So we did everything we could in a single day. Next. So this is another site called the Gorto site in the UP, and you'll immediately see a similarity with Rainier and Pope, right? You've got all of these large Hickston silicified sandstone bifaces. The types are a little bit different. There are some Hardens in here. There are some Scotts Bluff looking things. There's also some points that look like a type called St. Charles from the St. Louis area, which are also about 10,000 years old. And then there's what a friend of mine in Canada calls that mishmash of spear points that you find in the UP in Ontario. It's like the people up there threw out the rule book and made whatever they wanted in any kind of shape. But these points all date to about 10,000 years ago. And there is one chert corner notch point in the middle of the frame there. And that's sort of an intriguing point because a chert point like that was also found at Rainier. And initially it was not associated with the site. It was seen to be a completely different artifact. We used to think those points were much younger. Now we realize that point, which is similar to what's called a Kessel point in Illinois, doesn't really have a good type in Wisconsin. We now realize that maybe they were adding a single point that we always thought was separated in time by thousands of years. Maybe those points are being made but used differently 10,000 years ago. Unfortunately, the Gorto site was found when they lowered a reservoir to do some work on a dam. Local artifact collectors went out, found a few points, and realized that they had a really important site and went back and really looked hard. But basically, they picked these off the surface, then they fixed the dam and flooded it. So no one's been able to get back in there because this site is underwater. There was also no bone found, but again, 10,000-year-old bone underwater doesn't preserve particularly well either. Next.
Ray?
Yes.
What are the different colors? Some of those are two different colors.
On the individual points?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what's going on there, Megan, is those are pieces that were broken and completely weathered differently, but they fit back together. So that lets you know that the pieces were broken and got soil staining or water staining from different chemicals in the soil, but they fit back together so you know they're exactly the same point. And I'm glad you brought that up because we also see that at the Pope site. In fact, one of the points that Paul showed me, you're not going to remember this, but it's the third point from the left. Paul had found the base and the tip over about 40 or 50 years. And he was always bummed that he didn't have the middle. He went to a neighbor and he said, an elderly neighbor, and said, you know, I know you farmed that part of our farm in the 1920s. Did you ever find anything out there? And the guy said, yeah, I found some broken arrowheads, and went out in the granary and dumped out a rusty coffee can, and he had the middle. So Paul put that point back together, which had been separated a long time. But that's what's going on here. These points were broken and weathered in different conditions and then put back together. Next slide. This is called the Cummins site. So this site was found in 1963 up outside of Thunder Bay. These don't look exactly the same, but these were found with a burned or cremated skeleton, supposedly. They were found in a gravel pit, on the edge of a gravel pit. So as they were mining gravel out, stuff was falling out of the wall of the pit. They have no idea if these points were with the human bones, which were burned. All they know is they found those points and burned human bone. So they recorded it. It was recorded as a heavily disturbed human cremation burial. And then, of course, they mined the rest of it out. So that site's completely gone. But this is one site that's also sort of fits the pattern in that there was cremated human bone and there's slightly burned artifacts. And you'll notice that on the left, that's Hickston silicified sandstone up in Thunder Bay. This is that site when it was dated at 8,480. That was the oldest site in all of Canada when that dating was done. The Mackenzie site is now a site that's fairly close to this, within a mile. It's both the largest and the oldest site dated in Canada until last summer. So there's a site in Old Crow up in the Northwest Territories that's older than this site, but for many years this was the oldest site in Canada. Next. This is a site called Elmwood Island, and this is a site kind of in the center part of the state. These artifacts are not burned, but they're made out of Hickston silicified sandstone. They're Scott's Bluff hardened, meaning they're this weird combination of traits. They're covered with red ochre, and they sort of got skipped. Basically, an archaeologist went out and was doing survey work where a highway was going to go through. He hit a huge middle woodland village, so a village that was about 1,000 to 1,500 years old. Found lots of artifacts. They continued to dig down. Right at the very end of the excavation, before they were quitting, he hit this. He wrote up the whole site and never wrote this up. But sort of the word got around that these Hickston Scottsbluff points were found below this village site. So we don't have a date on these, except that we know they're at least 10,000 years old and they're covered with red ochre. So these are kind of thrown into the same basket. It's the time period. It's obvious that something ritualistic is going on. No bone was found with them, so we don't think it's necessarily a burial. And these are not broken, they're whole, so they don't fit exactly. Next. This is the Crowfield site. And so the Crowfield site is interesting in that these points are fluted. They have a big channel flake like the Clovis and Gainey points do. So this is sort of the tail end of what's called the fluted point tradition, which people basically think of as early mammoth hunters. This is kind of an eastern variation on fluted Clovis points. But almost 30 of these were found at this site. That's more fluted points than have ever been found on any early site in anywhere in North America. That's a huge number of points. And certainly, these type of points, now called Crowfield points after the site, don't tend to occur much outside of northern Wisconsin, the UP, a little bit up into Ontario, and then just a little bit in the eastern Great Lakes. Next. There were also a lot of bifaces at the Crowfield site. And all of these artifacts went through an extremely hot fire. So these are bifaces. All of these are made out of a type of material called Bayport chert. And Bayport chert is exotic, meaning that these guys had to travel a long way to get this chert. And one thing that we see at all of these sites is that even if local stone, good stone is available, for these kind of sites, they completely ignore whatever is locally available. They travel a long distance. They get exotic stone, meaning high quality stone from another location, bring it back to a particular site, and then destroy it. So that also lends to the ritual aspect of this. So all of Crowfield is made out of Bayport chert, which they had to travel several hundred miles to get before they brought it back and destroyed it. Next. This is Dead Man's Slough. And I should also back up. I forgot one thing I should have mentioned. So at Crowfield, one of the interesting things about Crowfield is that often on archaeological sites, all of the artifacts are mixed up. So we don't know if what we call a spear point and what we call a scraper or what we call a knife today is how early Native Americans thought of those tools. Did they divide them up into those same categories that we did? Did they look at them the same way? We've never really known. You can't go back in time to sort that out. What's interesting about Crowfield is the projectile points are in one pile on the site. Scrapers are in one pile on the site. Bifaces are in a separate pile on the site. They put them in really distinct areas and divided them just like we would. You know, the names that we use for these artifacts are obviously not the same that early Native Americans used, but it's useful to know that they were looking at these tools kind of the same way we were. They divided them up into different classes. And at Crowfield, the tools aren't mixed up. All of the projectile points, all of the bifaces, all of the scrapers, they're in totally different areas on the site. That is one of the first times we've ever seen that on an archaeological site anywhere. Next. So this is Dead Man's Slough site up in the northwestern part of the state. Again, we've got big thermally fractured bifaces, again made out of Hickston silicified sandstone. We've got big spear points that are, again, this sort of northern Wisconsin weird variety that is not easy to put into a firm category. But we have burned artifacts at very high temperatures all together in one very small area. They did also recover human bone at Dead Man's Slough, but it's much, much younger. They dated the bone. These artifacts, again, date to about 9,500 to at least 10,000 years old. The human bone was maybe at best 1,000 years old. So we know that this site actually, it looks like it was an isolated site on top of a ridge 10,000 years ago when these artifacts were placed there. Subsequently, 9,000 years later, people showed up and camped on the ridge on top of this site. So we don't think there's any connection between the two levels of artifacts, except that people happen to show up in the same location. I'd have to go back to the map to show you. Yeah. I'm trying to remember the county name. Burnett. It's in Burnett County. Ah, all right.
So you don't know which town it's
I don't. Although the State Historical Society would be happy to tell you, and if you Google it, it'll come up. Yeah. There hasn't been a lot of archaeological work done in Burnett County, period. This was part of a highway project when they hit this site. So, and that's part of the problem. Many of these sites, if they're in nondescript areas, they're not close to recent development, they're not on a lake shore where things are being developed, they're not on a river where things would have gotten developed. There may be many more of these sites. We just have not discovered them, or we have not recognized them in the past. Next. So these are more artifacts from Dead Man's Slough. There's also whole bifaces that were not burned. And there's also woodworking tools, adzes. But again, this site has something else going on. People were, in addition to whatever this thermal event where they created and then burned the artifacts, there was something bigger happened on that site afterwards. And it complicates things because you often get deflation in the archaeological records. So things that might be separated by 6 inches or 12 inches or several feet, over time, if the soil deflates, all of the stone artifacts end up on one layer, like during the Dust Bowl in the 20s and 30s. Many archaeological sites, the dirt blew away and all those discrete individual layers ended up on one flat layer. So all the tools are mixed together, which makes it tricky to sort it out. Another thing that can happen in heavier soils is artifacts that are near the surface will stay there, but frost will bring lower artifacts up. And so they actually can mix those artifacts. It's called bioturbation, meaning there's natural reasons why the artifacts tend to all end up on one level. That's certainly what happened at Dead Man's Slough. It's really difficult to tease out what happened when there, with the exception of these really early 10,000-year-old burned Hixton artifacts. Next. And then we get to the Caradoc site. Again, made out of Bayport chert. What's different about this site is none of these artifacts are burned. This site was found, there was a pasture that had never been plowed. It had been cleared of trees and used as a pasture for about 50 years. They decided to plow it. The first time they plowed it, they found all of these artifacts right near the surface, like within an inch below the sod line. And the artifact collector who found them realized this is really odd looking artifacts. Something odd is happening here. And they're all right at the very surface. So he called in the guy who had actually excavated the Crowfield site, which we've already talked about. These artifacts, instead of being burned, they again traveled several hundred miles to get this Bayport chert, which is a really high quality chert. They made these very large bifaces. They brought them back to the Caradoc site. They set them on an anvil stone, a stone about the size of a big 16-inch softball, and they smacked them right in the middle and radially fractured all of the points. This is not the type of fracture you get when you use a tool. This is not the type of break you get when you hit something with a plow or a disc. Lots of stone tools get broken by ag equipment, but those fractures all originate from the edge of a tool, where a plow or a disc or a cultivator hits the edge of a stone tool and breaks it. It's very easy to tell when that happens. These are all broken from the center, and the anvil stone was found right in the middle of the site, and a hammer stone that we think that they used to smash these tools. So again, this is ritual destruction of tools that have never been used, that are made of super high quality stone, that got hauled 200 miles and then destroyed and left on the surface, and the people just walked away and never came back. Next. These are more pieces from Caradoc. There weren't a lot of projectile points, but that projectile point on the left is contemporaneous with Crowfield and Gainey, so that's a early Paleo-Indian point, meaning by the time they made those points, mammoths and mastodons were on their way out and they were probably hunting woodland caribou, but it's still, that's about an 11,500 year old projectile point. And then these are other really refined or super well-made bifaces. These aren't pieces of junk. These aren't early in the process. Somebody put a huge amount of work into these and then intentionally smashed them and broke them to pieces. Next. And finally, this is the DeWolf site. So not that long ago, Tom LaBelle, an archaeologist in Illinois, well, I guess 2000 is a couple of years ago now, but in the big picture, this was not very long ago. Tom called me up and he said, hey, I've got this weird site with all these broken Hickston spear points in it. And sure enough, over 50% of them are made out of Hickston from Wisconsin, even though this is down in northern Illinois. So Tom brought those artifacts up and we compared them in my office with the Pope collection. And what was immediately obvious is these are more lanceolate. These aren't hardened, they're not Scots Bluff. They're just a tad older, not a lot older, but maybe a few hundred years older than the artifacts we have. But what was immediately apparent was they're tiny in comparison to the Rainier stuff or the Pope stuff. These are much smaller artifacts, but they also have thermal crenation fractures. They definitely were put in an extremely hot fire, and they don't show much use wear, if any, meaning these are brand new spear points that were made and then intentionally burned to a crisp and fractured. Next. So what does it all mean? Well, the truth is we don't know exactly what this means. We do know that there are other sites in North America and in other places in the world where early indigenous groups gave a lot more meaning to tools and especially to some types of stone. And red ochre is a good example of that. But also we think that Hickston was used as a ritual kind of stone. It had some kind of meaning beyond its use as a tool. And a couple of ideas that I want to throw out there that are based on early ethnographic accounts of hunting and gathering people. One is that early humans, not everywhere, but in some places, they would actually go to a quarry site, obtain the stone, make stone tools, and when that tool was completely worn out and exhausted, they would travel back to the site and give the stone back to the quarry. And we've seen that at a quarry site in Montana where we have Clovis points that are exhausted, smeared with red ochre, and reburied at the quarry site where the stone originally came from. I know that was true in North Australia where I worked. Not so much with flaked artifacts, but with stone that was used to make stone axes. Stone axe would be made, it might be worn out in a generation or 2 generations. Whenever it was worn out, the owner was obligated to travel back to the quarry where that stone was originally dug and deposit that worn out axe back in that quarry. That end of use life approach speaks way more to going to Walmart, picking something up and pitching it when you're done. You know, it's a different approach to stone and what stone means and how important it is to you. So a few things, you know, these artifacts are being produced on non-local materials, even when really good local materials are available. So the DeWolf site in northern Illinois, Moline chert is a really high quality chert. The Moline chert source is about 20 miles from where the DeWolf site was found. None of the points are made out of Moline chert. Instead, they came to Wisconsin to get Hickston. So that's hundreds of miles to travel to get a different stone. 78% or 7 of 9 of these assemblages use Hickston silicified sandstone. So that means these guys put a lot of time and energy into getting these resources. And they didn't do it just because it was good material. And artifacts are being intentionally destroyed prior to being used at all or prior to the end of the useful life of that tool. And again, when you look at other types of stone tools, there were no fleet farms, no hardware stores. There was no place to go get tools or weapons. You had to make them. And so to intentionally take something that's really hard to get a hold of and destroy it means that you're offering something back. Artifacts exhibit variation in sequence or manner of ritual destruction, meaning some of those are snapped and then burned, some are just burned, some are smashed, radially fractured, and that pattern where the fractures all come out in kind of a starburst pattern, that only happens when you set an artifact on a really hard surface and smack it dead center. There's no other way to get an artifact fractured like that. Artifacts may represent a single individual tool set. This is what Deller and Ellis, the guys who dug Caradoc and Crowfield, were putting forth, that maybe one person made these points. We don't see that hold up at the other sites. We see lots of different individuals making these points, which raises another question. Why here in the center of Wisconsin do you have a number of different people making these exquisite large points all out of the same material and then destroying them and leaving them on the surface of the ground? Some sites may represent human cremations, but I'd say the jury is out. So far, we have found no evidence that these sites are human cremations. Some sites may represent secondary emplacement. So because no charcoal has been found with these sites and no clear feature or outline of a pit or a burial has been found, one idea put forth is that possibly these artifacts and bones were burned somewhere else, all collected, put in a sack, brought to another site, and then left on the surface. Native Americans did do that. They did, if they didn't cremate someone, they would deflesh the bones, or they would put the bones in a tree or a rock shelter, let the flesh come off. They would collect the bones. We call those a bundle burial. They would bundle them together. They might take them back to a home territory if a person died a long way from the home territory, and then inter those bones in a mound or on the surface a year or several years later. We know that from the skeletal evidence. And because there's no feature, no other evidence with these sites, like charcoal, which would represent a fire, that was one of the suggestions. We don't think that's really what's going on here. One reason is if you have a fire on the surface and it's very hot, in excess of 1,000 degrees, if you let that fire burn out, you don't have charcoal left. All you have is really fine ash. And really fine ash on the surface of the ground, there will be no evidence 10,000 years later. That ash is going to blow away and sink into the soil and basically disappear. So we have isolated avocational finds of Hickston silicified sandstone lancelets, meaning in the 35 years that I've been looking at local collections in Waupaca, Marathon, Shawano, Portage County, Waushara County, collectors often bring in a piece of a projectile point made out of Hickston that's fractured and that has gone through a fire. They never have an entire artifact. They only have a piece. And we've seen that over and over again. And one of the things we think, and this has to do with the last point, is that we know from early studies of like San Bushmen and Australian Aboriginals and even Native Americans, first people in Canada, is that when people move into a new area that is uninhabited or perhaps hasn't been inhabited for a very long time, they need to humanize or kind of make that area acceptable for human presence. And one of the things that's done is they bring in things and bury it on the landscape to kind of make that landscape their own. We think one of the reasons we don't find all the missing pieces at Rainier and Pope and other sites, and one of the reasons we only find little pieces of burned Hickston artifacts is we think maybe part of this ceremony or ritual was to have this extremely hot fire, and then maybe in subsequent years people came to the site again, recognized what it was, and maybe the same day or a week or a year or decades later they came back to that site and they took a piece of that ritual stone and they took it somewhere else and put it in the landscape. Where we excavated this year, we should have found a lot of missing pieces to the Pope artifacts. We found one little sliver, and that indicates that something else happened to take those away. Other archaeologists have said, well, how do you know these were intentional fires? Maybe this stuff was lying on the surface and there was a forest fire, or when early Europeans showed up and logged it and burned it. You know, those kind of fires don't get hot enough to do what happened to these artifacts. It won't create those kind of fractures. And also, when you do have those kind of surface fires and artifacts burn and literally explode and blow up, the pieces are never together. The pieces are spread all over the place. At the Pope, they're all in one tiny little area. Same as Rainier, same for all these sites. The pieces are all in a really dense, confined area. What that tells us is literally you can just piece them back together. They're laying there. What that tells us is they intentionally built an extremely hot fire and either laid the artifacts in before they lit the fire or had a bed of coals and then added the artifacts and added more burnable material on top of it. All of it speaks to it being a really intentional approach. And some archaeologists call this an earth renewal approach, meaning this is an offering back to the earth. You're giving something back. You know, all the effort to go get this stone, create these incredible artifacts, then to break them and burn them and just walk away from them. It certainly speaks to some kind of offering. And the fact that we find them in isolated areas just kind of reinforces that. So I and Jeff Boehm are in the process of writing up an article to try and we're going to put this idea out to the archaeological community in the Midwest, because all of the things published to date are all based on what was discovered in 1959. Everything's been called a cremation burial, but we're now really certain that the burial they hit had nothing to do with the artifacts they discovered underneath it. And so part of the reason for us to go after this is trying to correct earlier mistakes so this doesn't go on. Next. And this is in memory of Paulie Pope, so or Pep as he was known. So those of you who knew him will recognize him. But I also need to thank a whole bunch of folks. Paul himself, Lee and Sue Halverson. Lee is Paul's oldest daughter. Willis Pope, Paul's son. Jeff Boehm in Oshkosh. Norm Meinholz, who dug the Dead Man's Slough site. And a whole list of other people, including students who I forced to work on this project. So I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have, and thank you. Yes.
Are there Native American stories that have been handed down to generations that tell something that makes you go off in some direction? Think about this. I know this is
In general, yes. Specifically, that might be a better question for Mike if he's willing to field a question like that.
I don't recall much because I was just a small boy at that time.
10,000 years ago.
But yes, there are legends, stories that go back. Talk about the great expanse of ice in one legend. So I mean, they go back. And there's a phrase he used, Mamawan and Makana. All my relations. And we're not talking about just people, talking about every little living thing. And we say that our ancestors, when we take those rocks into like a sweat lodge, we call them the grandfathers, because they are the dust and ashes of our ancestors, and they're reconstituted into rock. That's what people believe. And that, I believe, is something to do with the reburial of things. And we believe that too with the bones of animals, especially a bear. We harvest the bear. We don't leave the bones where dogs can get it or in some dirty place. You know, we take those bones and bundle them up. You take them to running water. You put them back in there. The skull of the bear can be put in the woods and hung in a tree. Even the meat of the head and the paws is never fed to women because it'll make them mean. we have rules, you know, strange ones to Caucasians, but and it all goes back to like the rebirth of the bear coming out of the earth. The first Menominee was transformed by the Creator. The bear, Great Lake Colored Bear, came up out of the earth and became the first Menominee. You'll see that in the carvings that were done by my cousin James Frechette. You'll see the ancestral Great Bear calling up to the Golden Eagle to come down and join him and be his brother. And on that rebirth, if you go into a hole in the ground, stay in there all winter, never defecating, never urinating, never eating, and then come out in the spring, reborn. If you ever skin a bear and you look at them, they have hands and feet, and they have the same set of teeth as people. And their ears are forward and their eyes are forward. So there's a lot of beliefs and legends. It's very complicated. People say, well, explain the culture to me. Right after you explain the Bible to me.
You got a question?
Well, I have a whole bunch of them. Flint or chert versus sandstone, durability, sharpness, same technique to shape or sharpen. Were some stones heated, dry, or steamed to shape? And process for aging of the stones or artifacts.
Okay, great question. So,
And did heat harden or a soft stone?
let's start it with the first one.
Okay.
So there is a big difference between sandstone and chert or flint. Pat, can you go back to maybe the first slide? So Hixton silicified sandstone is sandstone that started out as like pure white beach sand and then was deeply buried. And when you deeply bury rock, there's a lot of pressure from the overlying rock. And fluids, silica-rich fluids tend to flow through it. So just like this doesn't really look like what you think of as sandstone. This is extremely hard. These are white quartz grains, and in between them are opal. And so this was, pure white beach sand, and opal-rich or silica-rich fluid moved through it and silicified or turned it to rock. This will hold a really good edge. It's difficult to flint knap or flake. It's like trying to work a piece of concrete. But once you are a good flint knapper, this makes a really durable tool.
Will it be as sharp as flint?
Yes, yes, it will be. It tends to fracture around the little quartz grains on some Hixton. Other Hixton it fractures right through. If it fractures through the sand grain, then it's exactly the same as chert or flint. I have to remember.
The same technique.
They used.
About 25 years ago, they were demonstrating
Sure.
making arrowheads out of flint.
Mm-hmm. So this one, you can see that this has really large flakes on it, or hopefully you can see from back there, this has really large flakes. The only way to get these big flakes like this is called soft hammer percussion. So often when you first start, you're using another rock. You're using a hard cobble to just smash a rock in half and then take large flakes off the edge. To get these really big flakes, you need like a great big long bone from something the size of a bison, or you need a piece of moose antler or elk antler. You need a big heavy hammer that is not hard, that's soft like bone. And when you hit this, the bone bends, but the actual stone actually bends before the flake pops off. So this is kind of early in the sequence of flint knapping. And then later, they would work it all the way down to where they're using really fine tips on a deer antler to do pressure flaking, where they literally pressure the flakes off. But the process is exactly the same. There's also sort of this urban myth that a lot of arrowheads or spear points were made by heating up the rock and dripping cold water on it so it would flake. That's total bunk. All you'll do is you'll blow up the artifact, or nothing will happen. But you certainly can't flake artifacts that way. And I'm trying to think, your final question was?
Well, I know that when limestone is quarried,
Mm-hmm.
you can shape it pretty easily.
Sure.
Once it is exposed, it gets harder and harder.
And that's exactly the same with both chert and silicified sandstone. So, modern flint knappers will quarry stone or get stone that they're going to use to make tools, and they'll either bury it or they'll put it in 5-gallon buckets and fill them up with water and let it sit for years. When I was in North Australia, I was shown how to make stone spear points by some elders, and they said, well, we go to this quarry. They quarried a silicified sandstone much like this, except it was kind of a gray-blue color. They said we quarry it, and then we take it to this bank, this sandy bank along a creek, and then we bury it. 10 years later, we dig it up and we flake it. So this quarry in Jackson County, there are huge pits where Native Americans quarried this. Pits as large as the basement of this building. Huge pits, and this was all hand quarried. They were looking for stone that was below the frost line, because everything above the frost line was already fractured and broken. So you're right, dry old stone does not flake well. The wetter it is, or the fresher it is, if you will, out of the ground, the better it flakes. Yes?
My question is about the Hickson site.
Mm-hmm.
Is that near the
No, it's closer. I'm trying to think of the river that goes past it. It's actually near Alma Center. It's right next to the town of Hickston, hence the name. And it's basically, it's a big outcrop of sandstone that the glaciers kind of went around. And it's called Silver Mound because when Europeans first came, in the sunlight, this stuff really glints. And so there was no tree cover on it when Europeans arrived, and there was no tree cover on it for thousands of years. It was open prairie. And Europeans, for some reason, thought there was silver in it, so they started to try and mine it, and they quickly gave up because there was nothing there. But it's called Silver Mound. Other questions? Yep.
For example, at the Oak site, you said it's only a small area that you found things.
Yes.
So how far out do you go and how deep do you go to check if there's anything else around?
As much time and warm bodies as you have.
Go up 10 feet?
Yeah, well, typically you do a transect, so you try and figure out your best guess on where the center of the site is. And then you dig a trench one way, and then a trench 90 degrees to that, and try and cross the site and try and find the richest areas. And then if you have time, you expand on that. So that's what we did. We went to where Paul's son showed us where he thought the site was, and then we bisected it. So we started with 4 squares, you know, with a cross in the middle. And then we worked out from those squares, and we worked in the direction that we found artifacts. So some squares we hit nothing and we gave up. Other squares we kept hitting things, so we followed it till it petered out and we didn't find anything. It was pretty consistent. It was probably about 14 inches, I'm going to say, Pat. I don't think it was any deeper than that before we hit sterile soil. And you can tell when you hit sterile soil in a plow zone because you can see, one, there's abrupt change in the soil color, and two, in any field that's ever been plowed, you can see what are called plow scars. You can see where the tip of the deepest plow left a line. And so when we opened up the field at the Pope site, you could see those old plow scars crisscrossing each other. And when you went through the plow scars, there's nothing. So we know that's as deep as it was ever plowed. And we found artifacts about midway through there, and then absolutely nothing. Things just disappeared. And we found farm junk, pieces of mowers and farm equipment. We found a shotgun shell, and then we found the wad from the shotgun shell, so we know which direction the guy shot. Yeah. Yep. 3,600 artifacts total. His collection was donated by the family to the state of Wisconsin, and so I'm in the process of identifying all the artifacts from his collection. But a lot of it, the majority of it's from Waupaca County, certainly. Yep. Other questions?
Is it housed at UWSP?
It is now, yeah. And it will be until I get it done, Megan.
So close though.
Yeah.
They rebuilt highway 10 for years and took extra lanes, and was there a spot by Sheridan where they widened out the road because of some excavations or something? I thought I heard
Yeah, they hit the edge of an Oneota village, so about 1,000-year-old village. And they actually hit stuff from there all the way to Amherst, including burials and one village site that had a bear skull on either end of the village buried on top of crossed front leg bones. So Oneota is late woodland, ancestral Menominee and Ho-Chunk, we think. So Oneota, it's an odd term. So it's an Iroquois term. So it comes from New York State. A creek in Iowa was named Oneota Creek, and an archaeologist found stuff on that creek, which he called Oneota culture. So it's as bad as you can screw up a name. Oneota is messed up. So Oneota is you may have heard of Mississippian cultures, like the people who built Cahokia down near St. Louis. Mississippians were one culture, and their ideas, and probably some of them, moved up the Mississippi Valley, especially over in the La Crosse and Trempealeau area, and down near Aztalan outside of Madison. But they don't show up anywhere else in Wisconsin. And what we think is, to put it bluntly, they came into Wisconsin and got their butts kicked, and they went back to St. Louis, is what it looks like in the archaeological record. Yeah. Sure. So this is an odd volume name, but the Wisconsin Archaeologist is the longest running archaeological publication in North America. And there was a volume in 1997, and it's called something like volume 78 and a half. It's got a really, it's got a really odd name. That's called the overview volume. You can find it in almost any library, and it tells you about every time period in Wisconsin. And we'll talk about, it actually talks about the Pope site, and it also will talk about Oneota and late woodland cultures. Yep. Any other questions? Well, thanks for being patient, folks. If you want to see some nice Hixton artifacts, I have a frame from the Pope collection.